everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, How Global Leaders Think, Development Strategies for New Research, hosted by HRDQ-U and presented by Herrmann-Nehdi. Today's webinar will last around 1 hour. If you have any questions, you can always type them into the questions box. We will be answering these questions at the end of the presentation or as a follow-up by email. My name is Sarah Schaefer, and I will moderate today's webinar. Herrmann-Nehdi is CEO of Herrmann International, the creators and trailblazers of whole brain thinking and the Herrmann Brain Dominance Instrument. Anne is also the co-author of the Whole Brain Business book. Welcome, Anne, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm really delighted to be here to talk about this particular topic, which for me is of great interest because it's based on some research that we most recently completed for the book, the Whole Brain Business book, which was just published. And so it's rich in data, and I've got a lot to share with you today. We do have a lot of content, so we'll hold the questions to the end, which I don't normally do, but in light of what we want to share today, we'll do that, and look forward to hearing some of your questions about what we're talking about. But I wanted to start by just sharing that we're focusing on 3 big ideas and questions right now, and that has framed up some of this research. How do we develop leaders, teams, and organizations that can adapt and thrive more quickly? In other words, how do we build their thinking agility? And of course, that's a critical question for leaders today. Another question that we're hearing a lot about is how do we leverage different thinking for results that are greater than the sum of the parts? Really take advantage of that cognitive or thought diversity that's out there. And then finally, how can we create new value through new thinking among individuals, teams, and organizations, which is that focus on innovation thinking. We're really here to talk about the thinking agility component of these 3 questions, but our research right now is really focused on those 3 big buckets: thinking agility, cognitive diversity, and innovation thinking, all of which are relevant to leaders that we work with around the globe. Now, here's the agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit about leadership and sort of the state of leadership development. We'll look at the thinking brain and what you need to know about the thinking brain to understand this data. Look at the global leader data that we have. Talk a little bit about agility, and then briefly discuss 21st century leader competencies. So lots to cover. And I'd like to start with a poll. So before we launch the poll, Sarah, let me just overview this quickly. I'd like you to think about, for you, now this is you personally, what is the ideal leadership style? Not sort of intellectually or theoretically, but for you personally, what is the ideal leadership style? Is it being more receptive, enthusiastic, expressive, empathic, passionate, more organized, disciplined, practical, industrious, persistent, analytical, realistic, intellectual, objective, and knowledgeable, or more holistic, imaginative, synthesizing, curious, flexible, and open? So if we could launch the poll, Sarah. Okay, and as you're thinking about that, think again about your personal perspective on this. You think about what's ideal for you. I want to get personal here. And let me know when you're getting ready to share, Sarah, and would you just sort of read off what the different percentages are, since for some reason today I'm not able to see those.
Sure, okay. All right. It looks like most of you have voted, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. All right, and it looks like 41% said receptive, enthusiastic, expressive, empathetic, and passionate. 11% said organized, disciplined, practical, industrious, and persistent. 11% said analytical, realistic, intellectual, objective, and knowledgeable. And 38% said holistic, imaginative, synthesizer, curious, flexible, and open.
Great, thank you so much. That's interesting. So there's clearly a bit of a tilt here towards the number 1 and number 4, which is not really surprising from my perspective in terms of looking at people in our profession. So thank you for doing that. We're going to come back to that in a bit, so that we can reflect upon that as it relates to the data. You might want to note the color choice that you made. So if you selected the first one, it was blue. The red. The second one, it was green. The third one was blue, and then the fourth one was yellow. So let's talk about leadership development. Does leadership development drive business performance? Now, I would suspect that most of you think that's true. If so, raise your hand if you would. Just raise your hand if you believe. Do you agree that, what do you think? Do you think that leadership development drives business performance? Okay, I see lots of hands going up. Okay, well, I would suspect that if you're on this call today that you believe that leadership development drives performance. I'm not so sure we're so good at demonstrating that performance. And there's some interesting data. If you look at, the link to this report is in the deck that you can get, and so you will be able to get a distribution copy of this deck. Firms ranked highest among the best companies for leaders study done by Chally generate greater market value over time. Wow. So there's great data now that says that this is really important. And when you look at the Global Human Capital Trend Survey that was published by Deloitte, you see that analysts who are studying companies place a 35% spread on stock price. There's a 15.7% on equity premium for organizations that are perceived to have effective leadership. And there's a 19.8%, almost 20% equity discount on organizations perceived to have ineffective leadership. Now, for me, this isn't a big surprise based on the work that I'm doing in the field, but I don't know that some of our sponsors always know this. So I think this is really important data to share with them as we're looking for an understanding of why leadership development is so important. Now, what's also interesting, and when you look at that Global Human Capital Trend Survey that Deloitte published, only 4.3% are considered very effective in terms of their leadership. Wow. So what a huge opportunity for us to help move that number up. 4.3% very effective is not, in my view, as high as it certainly could be. So why do leadership development programs fail? Why are we maybe not getting the kind of numbers that we want? Well, here's some, McKinsey published a really interesting article on that, and they said it was because we decouple reflection from real work. In other words, we kind of go off and we think about leadership, then we go back, and it doesn't jive with our real work. A failure to measure the results. And so, we're not really actually tracking our results, so we're not able to fix things. Overlooking context, which I'm certainly going to share some insights on in a moment, and then underestimating mindsets. So all four of those are really interesting, and I would think about your experience with leadership development, and if you were able to, connect it to real work, measure the results, build in context, and really build in an understanding of the mindsets of people attending. So let's talk about mindset for a moment. Carol Dweck's work in the book that she published on mindset, if you haven't seen it, it's a really good read. She says that there are really two perspectives that people have. One is, even if you can learn new things, you cannot change how intelligent you are. And so you might think, is that true for you, or is that true for people that you work with? Would they have that belief? And in contrast, you might have this other belief. No matter how intelligent you are, you can always improve. And for some, that's to a large extent. So as you think about this, think about the people that you work with. And if their belief, her research has shown, if their belief is that people can maybe learn new things but cannot change their intelligence, cannot build that smart muscle, that significantly reduces their ability to actually learn and adapt some of what they're learning. So the good news from Carol Dweck's research is that you can shift that belief. And once shifted over to this understanding that we can't actually build our smarts over the course of our lives, you can see an improvement in people's ability to learn and actually take that learning and make it actually drive results. So an understanding of how people think and how their brain works is a great way to help people understand how and why they can actually build their muscle. And so we use that as a way to help people shift their mindset so that you can get better results. Now, one thing that you need to know about the brain, which is really important, and I think most leaders need to understand, is that our brains are designed really as pattern-seeking machines. We crave patterns. We search for them endlessly. We're constantly looking for patterns. And in fact, the brain is pretty lazy. We kind of, once we see a pattern, we lock and load with it, and that's it. And so that's the good news about that, is it allows us to do things like see and read something like this and be able to understand it. So type in, if you would, into the question box what you see here. Can you read what it says? Okay, and I can see most of you are actually being able to read that it says, quit stealing our letters. Pretty creative way to deal with the fact that the letters were disappearing. And so it also helps us maybe be able to see, even though this is partially covered up, what this says. So what does this say? Go ahead and type that in. What does this say? See if you can read it, even though half of it's covered up. Okay, so I'm seeing good times are here. Most of you are right on that. But when we uncover the other half, we realize, okay, so part of what happens is because the brain is a pattern-seeking machine, we might think we know what something is, but in fact, we may not, because it's actually only partial information. So that's the challenge with patterning. So let's do a little quick mental floss. I'm going to ask you to do this little experiment with me. And this is a little card trick, and I want to just see if this works for you. So I want you to select a card. I'm going to show you some cards in a minute, not these cards that are right now, but select a card, and then I'm going to ask you to kind of close your eyes and imagine that card. See if you can actually sort of see it in your mind's eye. So let's do that. Pick a card. So I want you to just pick one card, and now close your eyes and see if you can visualize that card. All right? So you've got a card. You're visualizing it. Okay, now open your eyes, and now I'm going to magically remove the card that you selected. Okay, let's see if I can do that. Do you see your card? Okay, no, everybody's saying no. Some of you are asking, how did you do that? How did that happen? Okay, well, I see that one of you knows that, yep, in fact, I removed all the cards. But by having you focus on just one card, you didn't know that I had removed all the cards. You were just focused on your one card. So our brain is subject to this sort of unintentional blindness, and that is that when we focus on something, we lose sight of other things around it. And that's why that context piece is so important. We need to always make sure we bring in context to what it is that we're doing. Now, one of the things that we know from a brain perspective is that we all process information differently. So I would like you to just react to this. I'm sure many of you saw this. It was a meme floating all over the internet over the last several months. So type in whether you see this as a gold and white dress or a blue, and go ahead and just answer that. Type it into questions, and we see that we've got a mix of people saying, some are saying, oh no, it's definitely gold and white. Other people say, oh no, it's blue. And what we know is that our brains are actually perceiving the reflection of light quite differently amongst us. And that's not the only place where we perceive things differently, because our research has shown that everyone processes information differently. Every single leader that you work with is going to be processing information differently. That is a fundamental assumption that you must make as you work with leaders. And our research shows from a thinking preference perspective, now there are other models out there that you may be familiar with. You may be working with behavioral models, 360s, and other kinds of models that focus just on behavior. That's external. Or you might be working with a psychological model, right? That's looking at things like personality type and other things. That's a psychological model. Our research is focused on thinking, and it comes out of understanding of the brain and how we think. And that's what makes it very unique and different from some of the other models that you might have worked with. So our research looks at thinking preferences and how each of us may be tapping in to those different specialized areas of the brain in a different way and to form our own unique thinking preferences. And so to understand our model, it's useful to look at the whole picture, and then we'll spend a little bit of time looking at each of these areas to get you better informed so you can be thinking about your own leadership style. And so, you know, you've got the performance in the A blue quadrant, and you might think about the selection that we had earlier in terms of the poll that was more about analytical, realistic, objective kinds of things. We've got process in the green B quadrant, which was more related to organized, disciplined, practical, persistent styles that you described earlier. We've got people orientation in the red C quadrant, and that was the response that was more about being receptive, enthusiastic, expressive, and empathic. And then we've got the yellow D quadrant, possibilities quadrant, which was all about that holistic, imaginative, synthesizing, curious, and flexible, and more open style. So I'd like you to be thinking about, as we're going through this, and we're going to spend a little bit of time doing that, what your leadership style is. And I'm clicking and I'm not getting any response, so let's see what's going on. Are we locking up here? What is happening? So I'm going to just escape and see if I can go back into show mode here. And there we go. So what is your leadership style? I'd like you to be thinking about your leadership style as I go through these. When we look at this issue of performance, you think about leaders that you know and people that you work with who are really focused on that bottom line perspective, really looking at always having a logical, analytical kind of perspective, really interested in money. You might think about those that you know, and if you were to look at an ad that exemplifies this, here's an ad from Lufthansa. Book your executives on Lufthansa and you can increase your company's dividends. Very strong focus on just the bottom line. Or perhaps it's more of a focus on process. And that's about getting procedures in place, taking preventive action, getting things done, more reliable, organized, timely, and planful. And if you were to look at an ad that really emphasized this, here's another Lufthansa ad. Dependable, a reputation earned on 6 continents and 77 countries and 150 cities around the world. All about reliability and dependability. In contrast, maybe you are more people-oriented, liking to coach, mentor, kind of in touch with your feelings, more sensitive, supportive, expressive, liking to talk, and more personal. And here's an ad that emphasizes that a little bit. Why your mother would prefer you to fly Qantas. And you see moms looking at us there, kind of with a caring and kind of an interesting look there, but we see lots of emotion in that look. And then finally, maybe you're more oriented to the yellow possibilities, looking at imaginative, inferential perspectives, willing to take risks, liking change, more curious and playful, or challenging, willing to challenge the status quo. And an ad, this is an ad that Swissair published a few years ago, and you can see this is the whole ad. And this is very yellow in that it's all about sort of imagining that's the possibilities there. You see that you're in this cultural environment, etc. So let's launch the second poll. What is your leadership style across these 4 quadrants? Is it more performance, process, people, or possibilities related? So Sarah, if you would go ahead and launch that. And what is your personal leadership style? Not what you think is ideal necessarily, but your style. Again, let's get personal. As you think about this, get real. Maybe you think about the feedback that you've gotten over the past. You might think about where you spend the most attention, where you get your energy. Okay. How are we doing? Sarah, if you could read that off for me.
All right, perfect. Looks like everybody pretty much voted. So looks like the results are 34% said receptive, enthusiastic, expressive, empathetic, passionate. Then 26% said organized, disciplined, practical, industrious, persistent. 24% said analytical, realistic, intellectual, objective, and knowledgeable. And only 16% said holistic, imaginative, synthesizer, curious, flexible, and open.
Now that's fascinating. Thank you so much. And we can close that out. I appreciate that. And what's interesting is that we saw a difference between some of what you consider the ideal leadership role and then maybe what your ideal and what your particular style is. Although there was still a very strong, very high percentage for that number 1 C quadrant, receptive, enthusiastic, expressive, empathic, passionate. And that clearly is the number 1 for everybody in the group. And then a little bit more of the B and A quadrants in terms of your style. And what was interesting is that there was a drop in terms of the style for the D quadrant. So that means that, you know, sometimes we are seeking different things from an ideal leader, but oftentimes there is some overlap. Raise your hand if you feel like your ideal leader and your style have got some great similarities. So raise your hand if you feel like there's some big similarities between those two. Okay, and we see that for many of you that's going to be the case, right? That this notion of being able to sense that you can have, you know, that you need some of what you prefer as a leader, and that's an important thing for us to understand and for leaders to understand in terms of do they go with their own style when they're leading others, or do they shift their style, which is really critical. So let's talk a little bit about our CEO study. We studied 9,300 CEOs across 1.1 million data points using the HRDQ-U thinking database. This is the Herrmann Brain Dominance Instrument database. It is a global database. It was work that we did in preparation for the publication of the Whole Brain Business book. where we have an entire chapter devoted to this. I'm just going to be highlighting some of the things in this book and there's a whole lot more in the chapter. And as we said earlier, again, there are behavioral constructs, personality constructs, talent interest constructs. This is a cognitive style construct that we're using. So if you're not familiar with the HBDI, it's looking at cognitive or thinking styles. And again, different from a premise perspective than other instruments, and unique in that it's a cognitive style approach. And so it provides a different angle perhaps than maybe what you've seen in some of the other research. So when we look at that, we have 21st century CEOs that have been active for the last 15 years, males and females between the ages of 30 and 86, the average is 49, and startups to Fortune 100 companies. And when we look at the breadth of this, 76 countries across 6 continents and 20 languages, so quite a comprehensive group. When we looked at all 9,300 CEOs, and you can see this charted on this HBDI profile grid, which maps to what we were looking at earlier across the 4 different styles, you see that there is an amazing degree of balance in the CEO data. And so that single hard line profile is actually their overall thinking style preference. The dotted line profile shows what happens for them under pressure or stress. And I think that's interesting, and the good news about that is that maybe there's a little bit more people focus under pressure or stress, and sometimes that's driven by values, sometimes that's driven by other circumstances in terms of how we grew up and some other things. But all in all, CEOs tend to have a lot of breadth in thinking and how they look at their world. I'm curious, why do you think that is? Type that into the question box. Why do you think that is? Why do you think CEOs tend to have this level of breadth of thinking? Yeah, and I'm seeing, it's interesting, the work really requires it, right? And so when you think about it, a CEO needs to be able to attend to the numbers, understand some of the nuts and bolts of the business, be able to drive the bottom line. They need to understand how things work, how to get things done, execution. They totally need to understand the people aspects of the business, not only internal but external customer-facing issues, and they need to be able to think about the future and competitive issues and drive a vision. So all 4 are absolutely essential. So let's look at how they describe the day in their lives, and you can see that these numbers are really pretty balanced with a stronger tilt in the yellow. So a day in the work of 9,300 CEOs. We have a section called top work elements in our assessment that looks at the top work elements. And what was interesting was to see that the blue was represented in problem solving. So again, that's not a big surprise. Conceptual activities in the yellow, expressing ideas in the red, and analytical activities in the blue. Now you'll note that the green is missing from this list. And from our research, we see that at least at the CEO level, a lot of that is getting delegated. If you look at the bottom work elements, fascinating. Writing was out of the 16, number 13. Teaching and training, which worried me a little bit because I do think there's a role in terms of the sort of CEO providing that constant education for the troops. And that's in the 14th position. Technical aspects in the 15th position, and 16th administrative. Not a big surprise. You wouldn't expect CEOs necessarily to have that administrative focus at all. So fascinating for me and interesting. I think our function has a role to play in terms of making sure that we're helping the leadership of the organization with that teaching and training piece. Now, always interesting and somewhat controversial to look at male versus female CEOs. I want to context this data in terms of looking at, again, lots of exceptions, but when we look at the average, we look at the male focus on problem solving, conceptual, analytical, and expressing ideas, consistent with the overall average. But when we looked at the female data, problem solving was number 1, but interpersonal moved up to number 2, expressing ideas in 3rd position, and conceptual in 4. So we see that interpersonal moves up in the rank, and I think that's fascinating and interesting as we look at the opportunities that organizations have with women leaders. Again, no good, bad, right, or wrong, but to help bring that perspective to the table in terms of really building a rapport and having that ability to connect well with others. When we look at their overall data sets, we see that There is a slight difference, also a little bit more yellow with the female CEOs, and that's, again, I think really interesting, and as we're thinking about women in leadership, certainly a great opportunity, and when we look at the actual data points, we see that there is not as much in the blue, and pretty consistent in the green, so the green's pretty much the same, higher yellow and higher red, and not quite as much of the blue. That's not to say that there's not competencies there. Again, we're measuring preference, but important to understand those differences in terms of how we're thinking and leading. A greater 29% in the A quadrant for males, which I think is fascinating. So the global CEO differences, if we create kind of a heat map here, what we found is that there were stronger blue preferences in India, Italy, South Africa, South Korea, and Singapore. Stronger green overall with the CEOs in China and South Korea. USA and New Zealand, we saw more red, which is fascinating. UK, Denmark, and Austria, stronger yellow. So a lot more on this in the book, but again, you know, not all CEOs are created equally, and there are differences around the globe as we think about some of the trends that are out there. And so all four quadrants are represented, as you can see here, and so we will find that the slight tilt in the data can occur and have some cultural influences to it. So as we look at the next generation of global leaders, we thought it was interesting to take a look at the manager versus CEO data and the leap that's required. And when we look at our managers across the globe in our database, you see that the tilt is quite different. More blue and green tilted, a lot less red and yellow. And I think there's certainly an opportunity for us to reflect upon how we bridge the gap. Every company that I'm working with today talks about how challenged they are with their leadership pipeline. Raise your hand if you are experiencing that, either with your client companies or the company that you work in terms of feeling like you've got the pipeline in place for your the necessary pipeline for leaders. And I'm hearing just everywhere I go, there just seems to be a gap. So opportunity for us to be thinking about how do we provide the thinking skills necessary for those rising, emerging, high potential leaders to be as whole-brained as they possibly can be to meet the needs of the organization. Now, I don't know how familiar you are, and it seems like many of you are working on this. I see lots of hands up, and we'll put the hands down here so that we can continue to ask for more of that. Drotter's leadership pipeline, I don't know if you're familiar, Ram Charan and Drotter did some really interesting work looking at the leadership pipeline. So we analyzed that from a whole brain perspective. And again, using the colors across the quadrants, we saw that that every stage along the way actually requires whole brain thinking. That, again, the degree of focus changes. So when you see, for example, at managing self at that level, you see a lot more green, a lot less yellow, and as you kind of move up through the ranks, you see that green disappearing and the yellow growing, as well as some of the blue growing. The red's pretty consistent at the top. It's maybe not quite as strong as it is maybe in some of those middle functions where there's just such a huge people component, but again, all across this pipeline, whole brain thinking is required. So really important. I think that's a fundamental premise we need to be thinking about as we're looking at our leaders. So what are the development strategies that you need to have to build this out? And how do you build whole brain leaders in terms of thinking about what you can do to make that happen? So the first step is to define the leadership competencies for your future leaders. What do those need to be? And one of the things that we developed this list from a literature view. We went out and looked at across all of the literature out there, the quote-unquote leadership competencies needed for future leaders. And what was really interesting is that we saw that they hit all four quadrants. And to be able to hit all four quadrants, you know, is I think an opportunity as we think about what development work we need to be doing. I think it's useful to do an audit. Where are you against your leadership competencies? Are your leadership competencies focused on today's needs? Are they focused on tomorrow's needs? Are they focused on today's leaders, or are they focused on your future leaders? I think that's a really important thing for us to be thinking about. And as we look at that, one of the things I thought was fascinating is you look at the ones that tend to be more whole-brained. Agility is a critical one, and this idea, obviously, thinking agility requires the opportunity, it creates the opportunity for us to shift between these different quadrants with some flexibility. Obviously, self-developing, aware, lifelong learner, and resilient are all very important. But we think agility and the ability to demonstrate agility in response to changing needs is a critical factor, because what it does is it helps to provide an answer to the challenge of our natural preferences, obviously tilting towards one or more quadrants. So what is that? How do we build that core leadership competency? What does that look like? And I think that's, let's take a few moments to talk about that. The way we define thinking agility is the ability to consciously shift your thinking when, and I would add as, the situation requires it. The ability to consciously shift your thinking when and as the situation requires it. And that's a very deliberate thing. And from a brain perspective, we know that in order for us to override our natural patterning, our natural thinking preferences, this requires deliberateness. And agility requires a shift in thinking. It requires us to be able to move between these different quadrants and do that with some comfort and some and have the awareness and take the energy required to do that. So I'm going to actually have you experience a little bit of agility by doing another little mental floss activity, if you will. So what I'd like you to do very quickly is I'd like you to solve this equation. So just take a moment to do that. Please do it in your head. Don't use a calculator. That'll defeat the purpose of the exercise. If you would, once you've got the answer, type it into the question box. Great. I see many of you are responding. Terrific. Okay, great. Well, here's the answer. The answer is 45. Now, frankly, I didn't really care whether you got the answer correct or not. I wanted you to experience a shift in thinking when you went to that very quantitative mode. Now, let's just do a little truth and confessions here. Raise your hand if you just decided to opt out of doing this exercise. So just raise your hand if you said, you know what, I'm not going there. I don't do math. Right. Okay, so yeah, I won't disclose how many, but several of you just said, you know what, I'm not going there. Now, does that happen with your leaders in a learning situation? Absolutely. So if we're not really anchored with a strong desire or a strong understanding of why that kind of thinking is important, we may just choose to opt out. So that's why it's extremely important to explain to leaders as we're developing them why this blue kind of thinking is so essential. Here's another activity I'd like you to do. So just, if you would, see if you can find the mistake. And as soon as you found it, I'd like you to type it into the question box. What is the mistake here? Give you a few minutes to do that. I see some of you are getting it progressively. Okay, great. For those of you still looking and starting to get kind of annoyed, here is the answer. So the mistake obviously was in the sentence itself. This required attention to detail. Now, we know from a brain patterning perspective, what did you do? Well, I led you down the path of actually looking in the numbers. So, you know, if you were looking at the numbers, you're like most of us, and you're sitting there going, 1, 2, 3, 4. What is wrong here? I'm reading it again and again. I'm sure many of you experienced that at first. Some of you probably more naturally just really started looking at the detail and found it right away. So again, a shift in thinking. Hopefully you felt that shift in thinking. Now, I'd like you to just take a moment to jot down how you feel when you're truly engaged at work. So it's important that you just sort of write down a few words. Describe how it makes you feel when you're truly engaged at work. You can type into the question box. That's even better. What are some of the things that you experience? How do you feel when you're really engaged? You're really, you know, feeling that sense of almost like it's not work. It's like so satisfying, so rewarding. Not necessarily the easiest. Fantastic. So things like energized, inspired, great. All right. So again, when you think about, happy, wonderful, wonderful words. So could you feel your thinking shift? And obviously, if you were sharing that live with somebody sitting next to you, it would shift even further. So again, that's a different mental mode, getting in touch with those feelings. And then finally, I'm going to ask you, if you can, to take a look at the screen, and something is changing every time this flashes. And so as soon as you see what it is, type in the box, what is it that's changing? And this is a little activity in the study of peripheral vision. Okay, so again, I'm shifting your mental mode. What is it that's changing? Okay, now some of you may be struggling with this, so I'll give you a little clue. I'd like you to look in the upper left-hand corner. Focus on that and see if you can see it now. Great. Okay, many more of you are seeing it. Now, think about trees. Think about the palm tree, the third palm tree from the left of the screen. Okay, so you can experience an aha even if you get a clue, right? So I'll turn that off because it's maybe making some of you motion sick now. But you see how that feels, that sense of change? So part of what this is about is understanding that agility piece and helping leaders understand not only how important it is, why, giving them the context of why it's important, but also what it feels like to shift and how to do that. Second of all, you want to teach them to understand their brains, okay? What is it that we need to know about the brain? And what we've learned is that from a thinking perspective, when you have diverse functions, you have diverse brains, you have diverse thinking at the table. So you will naturally have an array of thinking preferences across the different quadrants based on the functions that are represented in the organization. And I'm sure you experience this as you think about developing learning programs. So here's an opportunity. The great news here is that we've got breadth of thinking. The challenge is that we are going to have a different set of challenges in terms of that shift in thinking that may be required for each of these different functions. So part of the challenge there is to step back and take a look and saying, are we doing leadership one size fits all? And do we understand where each of the mindsets that we spoke about earlier around leadership programs failing, the mindsets that each of these functions brings to bear, and how might we adapt what it is that we're doing from a leadership development perspective? By teaching your leaders about their brains, how they think, what their thinking preferences are, how that creates blind spots for them, how that they can use those strengths to their advantage, is a fantastic way to then move towards that notion of thinking agility. So that's the second step in terms of development strategies that I recommend. And then once they understand that, then there's a skill around learning to identify and value different thinking, because it's one thing to know yourself. It's another thing to be able to say, I really appreciate that different perspective. And this cartoon kind of epitomizes what sometimes we might discover. Think different, but not different from me. Now, of course, none of you would feel that way, but when the going gets tough, sometimes this can be very frustrating, because indeed that means that then we need to stretch, especially with those that we're leading, to help them get onboarded to maybe a different mode of thinking than their preferences. Now, we saw this is particularly true in teams, and when we look at a 6-year study we did on team productivity with the U.S. Forest Service, teams with diverse thinking are more effective. Our data shows that to a clear degree. Whole brain teams were 66% more efficient, and 70% or more of the whole brain teams were successful when compared to randomly put together teams. So some low-hanging fruit in terms of looking at how to really move the needle with what it is that we're doing in a development perspective is to look at how we're leading teams and how you can get people really valuing different perspectives. Just because the diverse thinking is there doesn't mean that it's necessarily getting listened to. So one of the secrets behind the teams that were successful in this study was that there were no more than 7 people on the team, so the team could not be too big, and that the leader of the team demonstrated whole brain thinking in their ability to actually engage with the team. So you need to have that ability to value each of these different perspectives to actually make sure that they're heard in a team format. How many of you have been on a team with leadership that really didn't want to hear different perspectives? How many of you have experienced what that's like? Raise your hand if you've experienced what that's like. So often that's the case, and we get to task, and it's really all about the leader's thinking preferences and not the thinking that's available to the team, and it's really a huge missed opportunity for productivity. And, you know, this is not easy work. I love this. This was one of my favorite cartoons, TEAM. Well, together everybody and everyone annoys me. It can require having to put up with some differences, but I think once you understand why that's important and why, in fact, people aren't doing this just to annoy you, they're doing it because they think differently, there could be some huge ahas along the way. So another important piece around looking at valuing difference is the role of female talent. I think we've got a great opportunity to look at how women bring diversity to the workplace. Our data consistently shows a difference in thinking between males and females. Both add value, but they are different. And when you look at how we can actually add breadth of thinking, so if you're in a gender single situation, if it is more male than female, and we're seeing a lot in the tech industry today about this issue of not having enough gender balance. Well, it's more than just doing the right thing or being politically correct in terms of looking at gender diversity. There is a huge thinking bonus that comes from gender diversity. So as soon as you bring genders together, you are going to see greater breadth of thinking, as you can see from our data and our research here. And I found this really fascinating. Joe Folkman and Jack Zenger, both friends and colleagues at Zenger Folkman, have done some fascinating research in their data looking at women as leaders. And what they found, which I think is fascinating, is that women are rated as better leaders. Again, no good, bad, right, or wrong, but something they're doing is actually having a greater effect. Women clearly have the advantage in the extremely important areas of people, relationships, and communication. They also surpass their male counterparts in driving for results, which is fascinating, which is to say that I believe that they're doing the people work, and and that actually helps them drive greater results. So when you look at their data, what are they better at? Well, obviously, some of the red components that we've been talking about, developing others, inspiring, motivating others, building relationships, collaboration, and teamwork, all very much red C quadrant kinds of focus areas. They're also good at high integrity and honesty, practicing self-development, taking initiative, and driving for results. So in fact, that really, it straddles all four quadrants, but the areas where there's the greatest indexing over the norm is in that red quadrant. So clearly there's an opportunity here for us as we think about leadership development to help both male and female leaders better understand the implications of their style and how they can best leverage those strengths. Okay, fourth, develop skills and comfort for when and how to stretch. We have got to work with our leaders on how to do this better. I think that in our society, and I'll get off, I guess, on my soapbox a little bit here today, we're sort of uncomfortable with discomfort. And I remember years ago, I have a mentor who I've worked with for many years, Manny Elkind, and Manny, I called Manny one day and I said, you know, I was telling him about a leadership challenge that I was facing, you know, as a leader in my company, and asking him for sort of advice, and I was telling him how uncomfortable I was with the situation, and it had to do with a situation that I just didn't know where to go, and I was so uncomfortable, I was almost kind of frozen. And he said to me, wow, Anne, I am so thrilled to see how uncomfortable you are. And I thought, what? Thanks a lot. What do you mean you're comfortable with my, you're excited and delighted with my discomfort? Thanks a lot. And he said, oh, no, you don't understand. Discomfort is a sign of learning. So when I hear you uncomfortable, that means that something's changing. So that was a huge reframe for me. And I think as we look at this, there's a link to that flexibility. It's that willingness to be, to go to places of discomfort. In fact, I believe that learning will trump knowledge in the future. And so this notion of being able to stretch and being flexible, being the Gumby, so to speak, is important. And I love this quote by Oliver Wendell Holmes, which I think is just encapsulates this. A mind that is stretched by a new experience can never go back to its old dimensions. And we know from a brain perspective that this is certainly true. As we look at ways that we can help our leaders stretch, we can provide them with experiences and an opportunity to continually learn, to get more comfortable with their so-called discomfort, so that they can find ways to continue to develop in a very rapidly changing environment. And believe me, that environment is not going to stop changing anytime soon. It's going to continue to change, and be what I would consider to be, probably even more challenging than we even think it is today. So, getting leaders comfortable with this notion of discomfort, reframing it for leaders, reframing discomfort as learning, looking to help that agility quotient grow for leaders is really important. So what are the recommendations? Define the leadership competencies for your future leaders. Help them understand their own brains. Help them understand how to identify and, most importantly, value the different thinking at the table that they have around them, and often surround themselves with people who think differently, and not only have that thinking and that voice there, but to then listen and know how to incorporate that. And of course, that includes lots of different implications in terms of both a leader and their direct reports, but also the teams that we work on and how we bring those teams together. And then finally, how to develop skills and comfort for when and how to stretch. When do I put the mental energy forward to really stretch? And when do I sort of just stay where I am, and it doesn't necessarily make sense. It's not business critical for me to be doing that stretching. And all of us as leaders are facing this almost every single day in terms of some of the challenges. You might think about your daily life and your daily existence, and when it is that you're being asked to stretch, and in what ways, and other ways where maybe you aren't. And I know that, for example, that for me, when I look at the data analytics and all the analytics available, that's already kind of a natural preference for me. But the ability to go beyond what I already know and look at big data, and it's been a stretch for me because it kind of goes beyond what I thought was my comfort zone in the blue, but huge opportunity for us as we think about where we're going in our world and what we're doing. So I've had to embrace that and think of it as a learning process, and feel very comfortable with the fact that I don't know and that I have lots of learning to do there and continue to grow and learn. So think about what that might be for you. Think about where those areas of great discomfort are for your leaders. Highlight those. Help them understand and reframe that discomfort is about learning. And then look for ways that you can then help them become more agile in their thinking and make those choices. When does it make most sense for me to actually work with a partner or a colleague and have them really bring their strengths to bear? When is it that I need to really stretch enough to be able to effectively collaborate? Those are all choices that we're all making every single day. The more deliberate we can be about those choices, the better off we'll be. And having a language and a common language like this model really helps accelerate that, because you can work with others and help language around it. So it's a powerful way to do that. So let me, before we get to some questions, get a few minutes left, just close with this notion of I use not only all of the brains I have, but all that I can borrow. Woodrow Wilson said that, and so that's my message to you as you think about your leadership development challenges, you think about working with the leaders that you're working with, and what it is that you as a leader yourself need to be doing. Think about what you bring to bear and the different capability that you have within yourself, because you probably have more than you might think. The capabilities of those that you work with, and then finally think about ways that you can continue to grow and develop yourself. So that kind of concludes my formal section. I know there's plenty of questions, so I'm going to now hand this back over to Sarah to bring some of those questions up, if you would.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Anne. And we do have some time for some questions. So attendees, go ahead and just submit those questions now into your questions box. And while we wait for those questions to come in, let me share a little bit about the foundation of today's session. And Anne, if you would just like to advance the next slide,
Sure.
if you could. All right, thanks. And that is the Whole Brain Business Book. This will unlock the power of whole brain thinking in organizations, teams, and individuals. And for more information on this, please click on that link right there. And also, if you would like to connect with HRDQ-U, you can through our regular social media outlets. And don't forget to register for our weekly webinar Wednesdays at hrdqu.com. All right, perfect, thanks. And it looks like we have a number of questions coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and get that started. Our first one is from Leslie. How has the CEO data changed over time?
So what's interesting is that we found that actually there was that the shift that we saw. We did the same study about in the mid-90s, looking at and we had a smaller sample size at that time. But what we did discover is that we currently, when we look at what it is that CEOs do today, there is actually a lot less green than there was prior to that. I think it might be helpful if you could put that slide back up with the link, Sarah. That would be great, since I'm not sure everybody can actually get that link, or maybe you could cut and paste it and put it in the question box for people to click on it so they could get access to the deck as well as the free chapters and so on and so forth. So what we've seen as a change is primarily in the green, and I think that is not a big surprise. I think the world has shifted. We have a lot of systems in place that deal with that, and I think a lot more of that is getting delegated. So that's pretty much the primary shift that we saw.
All right, perfect, thanks. And just for the link, that will be in the chat box, and then also for the handouts, it will be on the handouts as well. So they are going to be getting that. And it looks like our next question is coming from Tina. What should we focus on first in our leadership development programs?
Well, I think first and foremost, you want to be thinking about where are the gaps. I would do an audit of your program and think about, you know, how recently have we really looked at our competencies? What are the complaints that we're hearing about our current leaders? That often is a sign that there are some competency gaps that are happening, and begin to really reframe your thinking about what is needed for the future, and then take a look at the thinking of those that you are looking to grow, and make sure that you're designing your development program in a way that's going to be most appropriately contexted for their kind of thinking. And I think once you've done that, then you're well on your way to then be able to then have the conversation around thinking agility and the stretch that's required for them to be able to be much more agile in their thinking.
All right, great, thank you. And it looks like, oh, Deborah, the book that we're referring to is the Whole Brain Business Book. So I think we've got all the questions covered for today. So Anne, would you just like to add any final thoughts before I go ahead and wrap up this session for us then?
All right. Yeah, I would just say as we look at what it is that that I feel is really important, taking that opportunity to really look at where your thinking is first is the place to start. Because so often our whole perspective on leadership, and you recall that I had you start thinking about your ideal leadership style and then your actual style. I think we have some assumptions, and I know I have to constantly put my own assumptions in check around, you know, who I am as a leader, what my perception of great leadership is. And what's exciting for me is that when you look at the research right now in the literature, the competencies out there are really across the board. So there's really something for everybody. There's a place of comfort for everybody, and there's a place of stretch, which I think is actually very exciting news, because as we're looking at developing leaders, it's always good for people to feel like, okay, I've got something that's really nailed and that I'm already sort of taken care of, and then I've got some other things that I really need to work on. And having that ability to kind of move in that direction is really, really useful. And so I would encourage you to think about yourself and what your perspective on leadership is first, then begin to look at where the gaps are, And, pay attention to your own brain as you're going through this process. And I think you'll learn a lot about what it is that your leaders are struggling with. And, use the brains of those that you work with, like in the last quote that I mentioned. Chances are you've got around you a whole lot that is available to you amongst your colleagues and so on and so forth. And I love this. One of the participants shared a question. Unless you try to do something beyond what you've already mastered, you will never grow, by Ronald E. Osborne. Unless you try to do something beyond what you've already mastered, you will never grow. So a great quote from one of our participants to end this session on. Thank you so much for your time, and really appreciate your joining us today.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Anne, again, and thank you everybody who attended. So we appreciate your time today, and we hope you found today's webinar informative. Thanks again.